So designer rose number 2 for this year. Eleanor Vonne Brown, an alternative publisher. I don't know what alternative means, that's why she's going to go through that and tell us more about it. So before we start, I said to her how you want me to introduce you to the crowd. And she said, I'm an alternative publisher. So I was happy with that because she's going to explain the rest. So Eleanor, thanks for coming.
Thanks. So hi, my name is Eleanor, and this talk is called In the Margins, Alternative Publishing Collective and Spaces. And this talk is going to look at groups of people who use publishing as a platform to produce and distribute material to find friends and allies. And it also is going to look at the alternative spaces that support and host their activities. So the artist and publisher Eva Weinmeier said, "One, publishers to find comrades." And I think that's an interesting quote. She said that in Control magazine, issue 19, which is run by artist Stephen Willits and has been run since the 70s, and he's still running it now. I have been running an alternative independent publishing space. I ran it between 2008 and 2016. I currently am without it because, as with these kind of small transient spaces, you're constantly being moved on due to rent increases or favours ending. So X Marks the Rockship was a bookshop and publishing project space that stops works by independent publishers. So publishers, people who are publishing things maybe outside of the mainstream. The X, I suppose, stands for a location. It's a strange word. The bookship is a play on words. So like a bookshop, but not like a book ship. And as you saw in the picture, here is a picture of me standing outside it with a boat. This was its last location at Matt's Gallery, which was an artist-run space which has been running in London for 25 years. It was set up by Robin Klasnick, and it was named after his dog, who was called Matt Emulsion. I was invited to have the bookshop in their foyer space during an exhibition they put on to do with publishing and writing. And I went there to begin with for maybe 3 months and ended up staying there for 2 years. I had the boat because there's a canal behind the gallery, and during the time we sometimes used to go out on the boats, and I recorded a series of podcasts called Expressionist Sirens, where I interviewed artists and writers about their books, mainly because, especially when artists and publishers are producing quite small editions of publications, there's not a huge amount of information written about them. So it was a way of actually asking them firsthand what their publications were about and distributing this information online about it. The work on the front of the bookshop and gallery is by artist Peter Liversidge, and during the 3 months that the exhibition was on, he covered the entire street with these signs, which were giving various different pieces of information about both the gallery and bookshops and things that he saw as people walked by. So it was a nice project. And actually Peter Liversidge is an artist that works quite a lot with producing his own publications. Usually they're proposals for exhibitions. So this was one incarnation of the shop. It's quite colourful, it's quite simple. Like I say, it's a publishing space which needs to be able to be pushed aside usually several times a week to make way for the different kind of publishing events that happen in there. This is an example of some of those events. So this is a flyer, I think, back from 2014. And you can see it's like looking forward to that season. We have launches of books. So we have the Ex-Operative book by Leard and Lamtime Brink, that I'm going to talk about in a moment, a photography book by Paul O'Kane. We have book clubs. I've never read her. And I also put on that autumn a series of publishing talks called Publication as Practice, that were looking at concepts of artist books. So we've got a combination of writers, artists and designers that came to talk there. People like James Langdon, talking about his contributions to the Serving Library, Simon Morris, who does a lot of work to do with performative reading and writing, and various different kind of publishing collectives who are working together. For instance, Nicole Bachman and Ruth Beale, who produced a series of events called Performances Publishing, thinking about how we perform the book. So I suppose by alternative publishers, I mean either small press, so people working outside of the mainstream, or people approaching the idea of publishing in a new, innovative way. So they're not even necessarily producing books. They might be producing publishing performances or texts in alternative ways. I made this diagram about the box ship. I was asked to do an exhibition about the shop, and I thought about what the different activities were which happened in this publishing space. So it was a bookshop, so there was a place for distribution of books. Most of these books were for sale, but there were also books that were for free that you could pick up or exchange. There was reading and writing that would happen in the space. I had writers in residence, and people could also come in and sit on the sofa and read books during the opening hours. I had a risograph and a photocopier in the space, so different people would come and use it to print small zines and posters or material for some of the events that were there. And each book launch was often accompanied by either a performance or some kind of event. That could be a reading, it could be an exhibition of books, a talk, or a screening. And in the middle of this ex-operative O, I drew an X, and the X that kind of went through the middle was the exchange that happened. It's almost like the table in the middle of the room where people got together. The exchange is maybe to do with education or exchange of information, or where there's a chance for an artist to meet a designer, or a designer, artist and designer to meet a publisher. And it operated as a place, a social space, where different people from the publishing community could get together, meet one another, and sometimes we go on to make books together. So I was stocking books by independent publishers, and they often took different formats, some of which I'm sure you're familiar with. But they often, sometimes through production, were made in ways which made it harder to be distributed through larger shops. They might not have a spine, for instance. They might be a strange format, or they might have alternative content which wasn't necessarily accepted in sort of major shops. So these books here, actually I stocked from Berlin. I did a display of Berlin bookshop and distributor called Motto Books. And I would regularly invite different publishers to exhibit their books as part of, I would do Publisher of the Month or different exhibitions or displays where I'd invite people to show a back catalogue of their works. It could be anything from an artist magazine to, I also had a collection of artist records. So I was quite interested in audio publishing as well, so different formats of publishing. And I had many books which were produced using risography too. Do you have a risograph at the college? No. So definitely throughout my tenure of being a bookseller between 2008 and 2016, I saw a really large increase in designers and artists working with risography. I suppose because it was a medium which suddenly became fashionable, and also colleges started to buy them, and students were using them and producing books because it was much cheaper to produce books this way. So this book is a book called Toponym, and it's by an artist called Leah Nam Ten Brink, and it's actually like a collection of her research material, and it was published by a publisher called Lemon Melon. And there's a series of predominantly black and white photographs, but there's lots of colour risotip-ins in as well. Maybe I'll switch to my other screen, which is here. So yeah, this is. By tip in, I mean that the colour images are stuck in. And they sometimes go around the corners. I'm going to go back again in a minute, actually. Here we go, right here. So, yeah, Leah talks about toponym as a research project from a journey that she went on across Asia. And she says, missionaries used to speak of dreams as the god of savage, but through my hands they have always slipped like mercury. So toponym is a work of poetic documentary montage, a journey through form that segues between text and images, traversing registers that in turn are technical 1950s peaking. From a surveyor's passage through Victorian London to a historian's taxonomy of shadow, and from Renaissance autobiography to the musicological diagrams of a modernist composer. The act of the waking moment was spent devising and revising solutions of their most basic needs and ransacking all of his property of raw materials. So she's used the book in this kind of, she runs a line through the book as a way of kind of documenting the history of this archive. And it was produced in an edition of 200 copies. And I think was distributed as part of a PhD which she was doing at Goldsmiths, and then also stocked at various different project spaces across both London, Europe, and in Asia. Another group which I work with on a fairly regular basis was a group of funny women who published this book, which translates as Clever Men's Art. So this is Rosalie Schweiker, and she is a German artist living in London at the moment. And she published this with Maria Guggenbroecker, who is she's based in Amsterdam and is the editor of Girls Like Us journal. So they launched this, and then they put on a host of events that went with it. This is a collection of the funny women as they would meet in different locations, getting a group of women together and then publishing this Clever Men's Art publication afterwards. The Clever Men's Art journal is a Google translation of artist statements. So it looks at the tradition of the artist statement, the reviews and the portraits of sort of male artists, and it's a response to the fact that the art world gladly incorporates feminism, immaterial labour, care and unprofessionalism, anti-hierarchical structures, institutional critique and everyday aesthetics, as long as they are authored by a man. So Clever Men's Art exposes the art world's mechanism of endorsement as empty, ridiculous, repetitive, megalomaniac and boring phrases, a system of mutual self-validation in which a harmless and anticipated criticality is a token exchanged. So Clever Men's Art is a joke about Clever Men's Art, and it's edited, like I say, by Rosalie Schweiker and Maria Guggenbroecker, who have published many things. Actually, Maria also publishes I'm Your Sister, which is also another Amsterdam-based sort of feminist journal. And also runs Butcher's Tears, which actually is a publishing space I'm not going to talk about today, but it's based in Amsterdam. So I was also running a series of book clubs, and I think that book clubs are an excellent way of bringing a group of like-minded people together. Jessie McLaughlin, she ran the book club called I've Never Read Her, which was short fiction and essays by women. And she was a young writer who set it up as a way, I think, of meeting other women writers and artists in London. And yeah, she set it up. It was a monthly event, and she was choosing different writers every month. So anyone from Margaret Atwood, female body, but also she was looking at lots of authors from other countries. So we had the anthology Inside and Other Short Fiction by Japanese Women that was edited by Ruth Ozaki. And also No Sweetness Here by Anna Atta Adu. And also the playwright Sarah Kane we read too. I think it ran for about 2 years, so every month there would be a different woman author. And there was always a different group of, well, there was a regular group of women that came, but a new group of women joined every month. We had other book clubs too. There was the erotic book club that ran for 4 years. So imagine that we've read 4 years worth of erotic fiction. Also, we had the Publishers Forum book club, where a group of publishers got together reading works that were being written about contemporary publishing and design in London and in Europe, actually. So I think as a device, it's a good way to begin to get people together, is to sort of suggest ideas for book clubs. So you can sort of be reading material, background material, which, and you can find like-minded people, and from there you tend to find your group, which you then might go on to work with, either by in design collective ways or by producing publications. Other activities we did, this is the launch of the Hatto Press studio cookbook, and it was a launch lunch. And the idea was that this Hatto Press is a risograph printer and design collective that have been running probably for about 8 years or so. They run a Riso Press in East London, which is used by lots of different designers and artists, and it's set up by two designers. And they had written to different studios, inviting them to submit the recipe which they tended to cook for lunch in their collectives or studios. So they wrote to people like Martino Gamper or Ryan Gander and said, can you let us know what you tend to cook? And these recipes were compiled together, made into a book, and for the book launch they then also asked people to create those recipes which were eaten at the same time as the book launch. And so this type of kind of generous communal activity happened on quite a regular basis, and I think formed quite a strong backbone of some of the activities that happened at the shop, this idea of collectively coming together to eat together. And they were kind of welcoming events which introduced people to different forms of publishing in quite a friendly and open-armed manner. I've just been working with Rabbits Road Press, which has been running since January of this year, and it's based in Manor Park in East London. I did a workshop there on Saturday, a risograph workshop, and it's basically a new space which is open to the public. And if you haven't used a risograph yet, maybe you could go and use one here because they have an open access printing program. So, she says, looking for her next. So Rabbit Road Press is a community risograph print studio and publishing press run by artist collective UNC, which stands for One of My Kind, within the Rabbits Road Institute, which has been running, I think, for several years in this old library in Manor Park. The focus there is facilitating original work between the local community and artists in and around the old Manor Park library. And this small-scale publishing press and custom binding facility is making zines and small publications on demand. So their events programme over the next 6 months will explore contemporary model for community publishing, and it's bringing together these artists and designers and writers. And they've got a scheduled programme which is on their website of print production workshops, drop-in tutorials and artist talks with guides by participants looking at developing their ideas into the printing form and demystifying the print production process. So I ran a workshop there on Saturday, an introduction to Riso, and we produced this book, The Caged Bird, which was a breakdown of a poem by Maya Angelou. And yeah, this was the end of it. So this was kind of something that was produced in a 3-hour workshop where we learnt about some different Riso printing techniques and some glue binding techniques too. So it's a really interesting project. It's open to the public on Tuesdays as a drop-in service, and also the workshops are on Saturdays, I think. So, and I think there are other times too, which are listed on their website, when people can go in and use the facilities there. And OOC themselves, one of my kind, I think, are a really interesting publishing group too. So it's OOC is an artist collective, and they produce the biannual publication called OOC. So it's run by Hiba Lamara, Sophia Niazi, and Rose Norden, and they're all designers who have all studied design here in London. So as an artist collective, OOC co-curates also the annual DIY Cultures Fair in London, and they run workshops, zine fairs, and talks about independent publishing and DIY culture. Their publication, Zine, it explores themes surrounding women, art and activism, and features work by women of diverse ethnic and spiritual backgrounds. And each issue centres around different creative themes, with more general content exploring topics of faith, activism, identity. So they often do an open call-out on their website, and they're keen for contributions from women of diverse ethnic and spiritual backgrounds, especially Muslim women. They also run a Studio OOC, which is a design collective, which for the next year and a half, while they have their residency there, will be based in the old Manor Park Library. I've been really interested in another project that they've just been doing too, which is this. So it's a study of publishing practices in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, Penang, and Nepal. And this is it. So if you'd like to come have a look at it later on, I've got some publications that you can come have a look at. But it came out of a residency where last summer they went to Kuala Lumpur, and they met the publishers of Odd One Out, and they spent time in Malaysia meeting other artists and magazine makers who were at the forefront of independent publishing there. So they did it as a way of understanding like what different self-publishing practices were happening outside of London. And yeah, they spent the last few months kind of transcribing all of the interviews there, and scanning all of the publications that they collected, and they put together this pretty unique publication of their research. So since running the bookshop, I suppose, since 2008, I've seen relatively few surveys of publications. I haven't seen anything actually coming from Malaysia. And I think that there are distribution channel problems that kind of prevent publications from different countries crossing into each and entering the UK and being distributed here. So Bookworks is a really established, so whereas Rabbit Rose has just opened literally last month, Bookworks has been like a staple for artist publishing in London now since 1984. They are a London-based publisher specialising in artist books, spoken word and printed matter, and they're dedicated to supporting new work by emerging artists. And their projects are initiated, they say, by invitation, open submission, and through guest-curated projects. So they regularly invite different editors to edit new series, and by doing this, they're constantly inviting new streams of people, publishers, young writers, artists, designers, to work with them. Yeah, they're a really, I think, exciting, innovative publisher, and they're based near to Shoreditch in East London. So they have a printing and design studio there, but they tend to distribute their books and do projects in libraries across London and the UK, and they distribute all over the world and contribute to lots of different kind of publishing fairs. This is a selection of the books on their website, and actually they've worked with them as well, so they also produce this book, The Library Was, which is a collection of contemporary zines. One project they've done recently, so the slide is not so good, but one project they've done recently was the Beyond Words series. So it was 6 artist publications commissioned for the Beyond Words. So this happened last year in 2016, And some of the titles were The Freedom Deficit by Between the Borders, and it was exploring the collective's ongoing concerns about issues of citizenship and migration. We also had Labasa Clayton's Forget That Guy, Message from a Freedom Fighter on the bottom left. And it's actually a pack of postcards that unpicks the conventional history of abolition of slavery trading through a series of conversations between the monument series in the ports of Bristol and Hull and the artist herself. You might be aware that Hull is a city of culture this year, and Bookworks have been producing lots of projects which have been based up in Hull, including book fairs and various live publishing events. And I think throughout the year there'll be lots of different kind of design, art and publishing events happening there because of this. The one I also liked was QTIPOC, Assemble, Jacob V. Joyce, and he illustrates a simple question asked by 42 queer, trans, intersex and people of colour. And the question is, if you had a superpower to free yourself from white supremacy, capitalism, ableism and heteropatriarchy, what would it be and how would you use it? So it's quite a playful but also deep take on this series, and this is one of many series which Bookworks has produced with different artists and designers. Another is the Lebanese archive, and you might recognise this project because it actually got quite a lot of publicity a few years ago. They used a Kickstarter campaign to fund it, and it received quite a lot of press, particularly in The Guardian, and they were able to raise, with also some Arts Council funding, they were able to raise the money to produce this book. But it's a lovely photo book, which is a collection of archival photographs from Lebanon and the Middle East, which came into the hands of Anya Dobroska in 2010 when she was doing a residency at Space in Camden. And while she was there, she met Derb Al-Karisti. That's right, yeah. And she was like a Lebanese emigre who was living there at the time, so she met her in this hostel. And the images were taken and collected by Al-Karisti over a lifetime. So she had thousands of photographic prints and negatives, including the numerous photographic assignments, images of everyday life in her hometown of Baalbek, which was on the Syrian border, and in Beirut during her student years in the early 70s. So yeah, it was this kind of fascinating kind of archival survey which was produced as this beautiful book through Bookworks. And this is just like one of hundreds of books which they've published since they started back in 1984. And like I say, so as part of their kind of publishing outfit, they also have like a bookbinding studio there too. They also offer publishing surgeries, so you can take ideas for books there, or if you're struck with something, and they also offer like bookbinding workshops there too. So it's a really nice organisation. I hosted Temporary Services as my publisher of the month, probably back in like 2011. And Temporary Services, they are a collaboration between Brett Bloom and Mark Fisher. This is a picture of them at the New York Book Fair last year. And the woman with them is actually Karen de Jong, who runs Print Room in Rotterdam, which is actually a publishing project space, a little bit like X Marks the Box Ship, but based in Rotterdam. But this is them at their stall at the New York Book Fair, which is this huge, sprawling book fair for artists, books and independent publishers that happens annually. It's hosted by Printed Matter, who is probably America's leading independent and art and design bookshop. And for many years it was ran by A.A. Bronson, who was from the collective General Idea. So Temporary Services, they operate as a collective, and their press is called the Half Letter Press. They have been working together for 18 years, and in that time they've produced 115 publications, many of which are kind of small zines, but some of which are quite substantial. So they're based in Chicago, but I think they've also been lecturers over in Europe for some of that time too. So they produce some really interesting stuff, and they're definitely an interesting kind of activist organisation, interested in many things, including art, activism and architecture. One of their projects that I really enjoyed was this one. It's called Prisoners' Inventions. And it came about by them meeting Angelo, who was a 56-year-old artist who was, probably still is, he's incarcerated in the Californian prison system. So he's been a lifelong draftsman with extraordinary ability, and Temporary Services put together an exhibition of his drawings and works, and they also produced this publication. So they asked Angelo to illustrate and describe the many incredible inventions made by prisoners that he had seen or made or heard about over the years that he'd been in prison. So these inventions are an attempt to fill needs that the restrictive environment of the prison tries to suppress. So the inventions cover everything from homemade sex dolls, condoms, salt and pepper shakers, to chess sets, privacy curtains, and ways of communicating between cells. And they collaborated on this project with Angelo for 2 years, and then in addition to that, they had collaborators who helped make the book and the exhibition, and also they also remade some of the inventions. So yeah, it's a fascinating book and collaboration, and one of the reasons why I enjoyed it is because there's a really nice interview with Angelo where he's saying, and I think it's quite a nice approach to design too, he's saying, when he was first approached with the idea of illustrating the examples of the inmates' inventiveness, I was sceptical, thinking that there would be little or real interest to depict. But when I set my mind to the task, though, I recognised a surprising range of inventions and innovations that I had witnessed. I had just become so used to it, all that the uniqueness no longer registered. Writing this book was a revelation. To be able to present these examples of human inventiveness to you, I had to first discover their technology all over again. If some of what's presented here seems unimpressive, keep in mind that deprivation is a way of life in prison. Even the most simplest of innovations presents unusual challenges, not just to make an object, but in some instances, not just to make an object, but in some instances to create the tools to make it and to find the material to make it from. The prison environment is designed and administered for the purpose of suppressing such inventiveness. Officially, devices described here are considered contraband, subject to confiscation in routine cell searches, but inmates are resilient, if nothing else. What's taken today will be remade tomorrow, and the cycle goes on and on. And yeah, this is one example of many kind of pamphlets they've made, looking at, well, actually, they're very interested in just everyday inventiveness, and yeah, if you're interested in that approach to design culture, then they're definitely worth a look at. They've also done many kind of small library projects where they tour some of the publications that they make, one of which was a self-reliance library. And I have a really nice collection of one of their latest publications, which I bought in New York, which is called Hardcore Architecture, which, among other things, explores, well, it says, basically it tracks through Google Maps the locations of old hardcore bands based on the addresses that they would put back in their in the back of the mailing lists when they were distributing their music kind of back in the 80s and 90s. And they used it as a starting point to make a whole series of collections to do with hardcore architecture. It's a really nice book, also published with Risograph, or printed with a Risograph. How am I doing for time? Well, this is my last publishing group. And it kind of brings us back up to now. So this group came together last year as a result of the referendum. And yeah, they're called Keep It Complex, EU, UK. And I think this is a nice example of designers and artists coming together to do something, uncontent with what's happening in Britain in 2016, 2017. Actually, Rosalind Swiker, who was the artist who was part of the Funny Women collective, is in it. And she's also working with people like Maya Foster, who's from Europa Design Collective, and Robin Kirkman from, I can't remember, the Birmingham-based publishers who are called, I'm just looking for my page, she says, can't find it. From an endless supply. Okay, I'll have to talk about them next. So they say keep it complex as a starting point. It functions like a recipe point, a book, a song scorebook of angry note that someone left on the fridge, and it's a tool to get people involved in everyday politics. So we're using art to have conversations with people we disagree with. And they've done a whole series of projects, from banner making workshops to organising weekends, to introduce people to talk collectively about their concerns about what's happening in England at the moment. And they have used their design skills and their art skills and their inventive skills to come up with a whole series of kind of printed material and online public stuff to get people to think and approach activities in different ways. I love this one too. So organise a question time for debate, but not in a TV studio, in your living room. Invite your friends to be on the panel and get your granddad to be Jonathan Dimbleby. And I think this is quite interesting too, because it's kind of suggesting that we're talking about DIY culture many times here, and actually you can start now a press on your own, in your own living room, and to be honest, you can start a publishing space or a DIY space in your own living room too. You could do it at college, you can do it at your local pub, you can do it in your local park. You have access to all these spaces, and it's very easy to start a group, a collective, just find people with kind of common concerns and get together and open them up to a wider public. I started X Marks the Bookshop in someone else's bookshop. I did it because I didn't have a huge amount of money at the time, but I was really interested in self-publishing, and so I started it as a publishing space which would host book clubs, talks on publishing, and different events in the framework of someone else's shop. And then after I'd been running for several years, I was able to start my own shop and continue in that way. And in 2017, it's very easy to also publish your own material. You can use print-on-demand platforms, you can use digital printing, and you can still use the old traditions of DIY photocopying and distributing in that way too. But it's become easier than ever to kind of print and produce and distribute publications. And it's easier than ever to find other people who share similar views to yourself too, to be able to distribute them too. Here's just a couple of examples of some of their, they produced a series of posters and leaflets and stickers. I thought it was quite funny. And they just invited different designers to contribute too. One way to really bring attention to a campaign, as you know, is to actually invite different, to create a really good visual identity around it. And so they use these devices to bring people together. Unfortunately, maybe not successfully that time, but it was a really good way of actually bringing people together, and I think collectively giving people tools with which to approach these forthcoming years. So look them up. It's EU UK. So I think I'll probably bring my talk to an end here. I just wanted to use these are just several examples of different publishers and collectors that I've worked with or met over the last few years. There are many spaces all over. I hope that you will find out more about them and hopefully produce publications which might contribute to some of them too. So thank you.